The rain came down in sheets across the company parking lot, nearly empty at that hour. When Caleb Turner stopped dead at a sight no one else seemed willing to acknowledge, a pregnant woman collapsed against a concrete pillar, clutching her stomach, her breath coming in shallow, desperate pulls. No one stopped. No one turned back. He stood at the fork between his paycheck and his conscience. And he chose. He lifted her into his car and drove hard into the storm. He did not know her name. He did not know her face. He had no idea she owned everything around him. What would you do if doing the right thing cost you everything, or turned out to be the beginning of something neither of you could have imagined? The alarm on Caleb Turner's phone went off at 5:40 in the morning, the way it always did, with a thin, persistent chime that had learned to cut through whatever thin layer of sleep he'd managed to collect overnight. He silenced it before it could wake Grace. Rolling carefully off the edge of the mattress and padding in sock feet across the narrow hallway to the kitchen. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, if you were generous about calling the second one a bedroom. A kitchen that folded into a living room, that folded into just enough space to live. Caleb moved through it the way a man moves through a place he knows by feel rather than by sight. He filled the kettle without turning on the overhead light, set a bowl for Grace's cereal on the counter, and stood for a moment with his back against the sink, looking at the gray light pressing through the blinds over the alley. 29 years old. And most days, he felt closer to 40. Not in a broken way, just in the quiet, accumulated way that comes when you carry things alone for long enough. Grace's mother had left before Grace's 2nd birthday, and Caleb had done the math on that situation quickly and without ceremony, the way he did most things. He'd moved them into the smaller apartment. He traded the day shift for the overnight maintenance position at Vance Industries, one of the city's largest commercial property firms, because it paid $1.60 more per hour and came with a benefits package that included Grace on the health plan. He'd arranged his entire life around her school schedule drop-off at 7, pick-up at 3, every single day. And for 3 years, that arrangement had held together through the kinds of pressures that collapse less carefully constructed things. Grace came out of her room at 6:15, hair already tangled, dragging her favorite blanket behind her with the unself-conscious authority of someone who sees no reason to justify the blanket. She was 6 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her grandmother's habit of noticing things without saying anything about them right away. "You made the cereal already," she said. "I made the cereal already." She climbed into her chair and considered the bowl with the seriousness of a small judge. "Did you eat?" "I'll eat at work." She gave him the look she reserved for statements she found implausible. He sat across from her with his coffee and watched her eat. And there was something about those quiet mornings, the way the light changed slowly, the apartment smelling like cereal and Grace's shampoo, and the faint chemical sweetness of the building cleaner that still clung to his jacket from the night before, that made the rest of it manageable. The overdue gas bill on the counter, the leak under the bathroom sink he hadn't had time to fix. The fact that his work boots had started letting in water, and he'd been rotating them near the radiator each night to dry them before the next shift. Grace was worth every bit of it. That was not a thought he had to convince himself of. It was simply and entirely true. He dropped her at his mother's by 7 and drove to Vance Industries in the early dark. The city still half asleep and moving slow. The building was massive glass and steel, 42 floors, its lobby perpetually buffed to a mirror shine. The maintenance crew worked the overnight and early morning shifts, the invisible hours when the building was empty enough to actually service. The HVAC systems, the elevator mechanics, the plumbing that the day staff would hear complaints about if the night staff didn't stay ahead of it. Caleb was good at the work. More than good, actually. He had a mechanical intuition that his supervisors called useful and his colleagues called uncanny, an ability to hear a problem in a ventilation unit before the diagnostic software registered it, to trace an electrical fault through 3 floors of conduit without a schematic, to walk into a mechanical room and understand, within minutes, what was functioning and what was about to stop functioning. His supervisor knew this. The building engineers referenced it in 2 separate performance reviews. But in the hierarchy of Vance Industries, a maintenance technician was a maintenance technician, and the men and women who kept the building alive during its dark hours were not the kind of people who attracted institutional attention unless something broke. The company took its name from its owner, Eleanor Vance, though Caleb had never seen her. Most of the building staff had never seen her. She was known by reputation, a 32-year-old CEO who had inherited the company at 26 after her father's death, and had spent the 6 years since transforming a mid-sized property management firm into something considerably more powerful. The word most commonly used about her, by people who worked several floors above Caleb, was controlled. Also, exacting. Also, private. Her office was on the 41st floor. Access to her was managed by a woman named Sophia Blake, who had, by all accounts, turned that access into an art form. To Caleb, Eleanor Vance was a name on a lobby directory and a framed portrait in the corridor near the service elevators. A sharp-featured woman in a gray blazer, looking out at the frame with the expression of someone who has made their peace with being decisive. He noticed the portrait occasionally when he passed it during the overnight hours. He didn't think about it, exactly. It was just part of the building. The way the ventilation ducts were part of the building. The weeks had been grinding in a way that didn't announce itself loudly but wore on him steadily. October had brought an unexpected rate increase on the apartment's heating supplement, and Grace's winter coat from the previous year was too short at the cuffs and the hem. He'd been setting money aside carefully, in a way that required recalculating after every grocery run, but the margins were thin enough that any disruption would push him into uncomfortable decisions. He told himself this was temporary. He told himself this specifically so he could keep functioning, because the alternative framing was one he didn't have the luxury of inhabiting for long. He came into his shift on a Thursday evening in the second week of October, checked in with the overnight facilities supervisor, ran a diagnostic on the third-floor HVAC unit that had been flagging intermittent alerts, and then spent 2 hours on his back, under a service panel, in the parking structure, replacing a corroded electrical connector that had been causing inconsistent ventilation readings on level 2. The work was fine. It was the kind of problem that asked nothing from him emotionally, only attention and steadiness, and those he could supply without drawing down any reserve. He was logging the repair on his tablet when the rain started. It came fast and hard, the kind of autumn rain that arrives fully formed rather than building a sudden, hammering weight that fell on the parking structure's upper deck and poured in gray sheets past the open ramp entrances. By 8:15, the remaining cars on level 2 were thinning out as the few employees still in the building moved toward the exits with their collars up against the cold. Caleb packed his tools and started toward the service elevator. He had 40 minutes left on his shift. He heard it before he saw it. A low, strained sound that didn't belong to the storm or the building, something human and labored, pulled taut with effort. Coming from the far corner of the second level, near the reserved spaces, he stopped walking. The sound came again. He turned and walked toward it. She was on the ground beside a black car, her back pressed against the rear tire, one hand flat against her rounded stomach and the other braced on the wet concrete. She was visibly pregnant, late in the 3rd trimester, by everything about the way she looked, wearing a dark coat that had soaked through entirely, her hair plastered to her face, her breathing audible from 10 feet away. The water from the upper level was running down the ramp and pooling around her on the concrete floor. 2 other employees were nearby, close enough to have heard exactly what Caleb had heard. One was walking quickly toward the elevator without looking back. The other had stopped, looked, and then found something to study on his phone. Caleb crossed the distance in a few seconds and crouched beside her. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. They were very dark, and beneath the pain moving through them there was something that looked like the effort of a person fighting hard against the indignity of needing help. "I'm fine," she said, which was a remarkable thing to say. "How far apart are the contractions?" She blinked at him. 3 minutes. maybe 2. A pause in which something moved through her, and she pressed her hand harder against her stomach. I called a car. How long ago? She didn't answer in time, because another wave hit her, and she closed her eyes against it. And Caleb made the decision in the space of that breath. He was 40 minutes from the end of his shift. He had his radio on his belt. He could call it in. Building policy was clear. Off-duty engagement with situations that created liability was explicitly prohibited, and abandoning a shift without supervisory authorization was listed as a terminable offense in Section 7 of the Employee Conduct Handbook. He'd read that section. He'd read the whole handbook during his first week because that was the kind of person he was. He made the decision anyway, with the same flatness he brought to everything. "I'm taking you to the hospital," he said. "Put your arm around my neck." She began to say something. He was already lifting. He got her to his car, a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked rear bumper and a heating system that worked about 70% of the time, and settled her into the passenger seat. And by the time he'd started the engine, she had gone quiet in a way that concerned him more than the sounds had. He pulled out of the lot and drove into the rain with both hands on the wheel and one eye on her, navigating the streets with the specific, focused calm of a man who has learned not to let urgency become panic. "Stay with me," he said. Not dramatically, just practically, the way you'd say it. She made a small sound that he chose to interpret as acknowledgement. The hospital was 11 minutes from the building. He covered the distance in 8, which required running one red light at an empty intersection at 9:15 on a Thursday evening, a decision he made without a moment's hesitation. He pulled into the emergency bay, and before the car was fully stopped, he was out and coming around to her side. He carried her through the emergency entrance. The automatic doors hadn't finished opening when he called for help. The staff responded with the particular speed of people who have learned to read situations from across a room. 2 nurses and a resident were there almost immediately, sliding her from his arms into their hands, a gurney appearing from somewhere on his left, and then she was moving through the swing doors, and he was standing alone in the fluorescent hallway with rainwater dripping from his jacket onto the linoleum. He stood there for a few minutes. The adrenaline left his body in slow, cooling stages. He thought about calling his supervisor and decided it wouldn't change anything to do it now versus in the morning. He thought about the woman's face, the dark eyes, the specific quality of effort in them, and he hoped, simply, that she was going to be all right. Then he went back to the building to clock out and explain. His supervisor met him at the service entrance with an expression that told Caleb the explanation wasn't going to matter. The meeting the following morning was brief, in the way that most worst things are brief. Brandon Cole had managed facilities at Vance Industries for 11 years. He was methodical and procedurally precise, and had a way of reading policy documents aloud, with the flat calm of someone who has learned to treat human cost as a variable rather than a weight. He was not a cruel man. He was a man for whom rules had become a structure he inhabited so naturally that he had long since stopped being able to see them from the outside. He sat across from Caleb with the employee handbook open on the desk between them, though he didn't need to refer to it. He already knew the relevant passages by number. "You abandoned your post without authorization," Brandon said. "You transported a civilian in a personal vehicle during working hours, which creates liability exposure. You failed to notify your direct supervisor before leaving the premises." These are each Category 2 violations under Section 7, and 3 simultaneous Category 2 violations constitute grounds for immediate termination. Caleb sat with his hands on the table. He didn't say anything. "I understand there were extenuating circumstances," Brandon continued, in the tone of someone offering a formality they don't intend to act on. "But policy exists precisely so that individual judgment doesn't create institutional exposure. If every employee decided to—" "She was on the ground," Caleb said. "I understand that. She was in labor, alone, in a parking structure, in the rain, in the dark. I understand that, Mr. Turner. But the policy is a piece of paper," Caleb said. He said it quietly and without heat. "The way you state a fact, you've made your peace with. Brandon looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at his desk. "I'll need your signature on the termination form." Liam Carter was at his workstation when Caleb walked through the maintenance bay to collect his things. They'd worked the same overnight shift for almost 2 years. Liam was decent in the ordinary way, brought donuts on Fridays, helped carry equipment without being asked, remembered people's birthdays. He looked up when Caleb came in, and then looked away quickly, back at his screen. And the speed of that avoidance communicated everything about how the morning had traveled through the floor. Caleb cleared out his locker without ceremony. A pair of work gloves, the small photograph of Grace that he'd taped to the inside of the door. Her school picture from September. Her hair in 2 uneven braids, grinning at something off camera. He drove home through the late morning in the thin autumn light, and the city was its ordinary self around him, indifferent, moving, full of people absorbed in their own trajectories, and he sat with the particular interior quiet of a man who has done something he doesn't regret and is now living in the consequences of it. He thought about Grace, and about the specific arithmetic of what the next month would require him to figure out, and he let the thinking proceed without panic, the way you let a river run without trying to stop it. The termination paperwork sat folded in his pocket like a weight that didn't have any weight yet, because he hadn't let himself feel it fully. That was a thing he had learned to do, not to close off, exactly, but to sequence. Feel the next thing when you can afford to. Right now, he could not afford to. Grace was at school. He had the apartment to himself. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the folded termination paperwork in his jacket pocket, and he went through the practical inventory of his situation with the same methodical attention he brought to a mechanical problem. What he had, what he owed, what margin existed, what he needed to do first. He didn't cry. He thought about the woman in the rain, her eyes, the sound of her breathing, the weight of her against his arm, and he hoped, with simple and unqualified sincerity, that she and the baby were okay. He didn't ask himself whether he'd have done it differently. He already knew the answer, and the answer didn't require examination. He picked up Grace from school at 3:15, and they sat on the bench outside for a while, and she looked at his face the way she looked at things she was reading carefully. "Bo Mert Kong?" she asked, using the Vietnamese her grandmother had taught her, deploying it with the precision of someone who understands it carries more weight than the English equivalent. "A little," he said. She put her small warm hand over his, and they sat in the thin October sun among the fallen leaves, and neither of them said anything for a while. Eleanor Vance opened her eyes in a private room at Street, Catherine's medical center, to the steady sound of monitors and the particular quality of light that belongs only to hospitals, flat, shadowless, oddly kind. For a moment she thought she was somewhere else entirely. Then the room assembled itself. The IV line, the pulse monitor on her finger, and Sophia Blake, sitting straight-backed in the chair beside the window with her tablet on her lap, and her expression arranged into professional calm, with a layer of something more personal just beneath it. "The baby?" Eleanor said. "Healthy. A girl. She's in the NICU as a precaution. She came a little early, but the attending physician calls it uncomplicated. She's very beautiful." Sophia's voice was steady and precise. Eleanor lay still and let that settle into her. She had a daughter. The reality of it came in stages, the way large things do. "How did I get here?" Sophia glanced at her tablet. "Security footage shows an employee from the maintenance division found you in the parking structure on level 2. He transported you to Street Catherine's in his personal vehicle." Eleanor was quiet. She had fragments of memory from the parking structure, the cold of the concrete through her coat, the rain on the ramp, the moment her body had simply refused the instructions she was giving it. And then, hands, steady and unhurried, and a voice that said the most ordinary and necessary thing. "Who is he?" "His name is Caleb Turner. 3 years in the facilities department, overnight maintenance." Sophia paused with the deliberate precision of someone about to change the shape of what they've said. He was terminated yesterday morning. Eleanor turned her head slowly to look at Sophia. Terminated. For abandoning his post without authorization. Brandon Cole processed the paperwork the morning after. Effective immediately. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the city continued at its indifferent pace beneath a pale autumn sky. Eleanor looked at the ceiling. Whatever was moving across her face was not the controlled mask she maintained in negotiations and boardrooms. It was something more interior and harder to read, working through stages like weather. When it settled, what remained was not hard to interpret at all. "Pull the full security footage," she said. "Both cameras on level 2. All of it." "Already done," Sophia said. Eleanor reviewed the footage in the hospital room that same afternoon, her daughter sleeping in a bassinet beside her. She watched the full 4-minute sequence twice, from the moment she had gone down against the car to the moment Caleb Turner's sedan disappeared down the ramp into the rain. She noted the 2 employees who had been within sight of the incident and continued walking. She noted the speed with which Caleb had crossed the lot, the way he'd crouched beside her, the way he'd lifted her carefully, efficiently, without hesitation or performance. She had Sophia compile his complete file. 3 years of service. No disciplinary incidents. 2 separate commendations from building engineers, citing specific mechanical work that had prevented equipment failures. On his HR intake form, in the emergency contact section, he had written, "Grace Turner, age 6, single-parent guardian." Eleanor sat with that file while her daughter slept, and she thought about what it had cost him. Not in the abstract, in the specific, calculated terms she applied to everything. He had a child. He had no savings cushion to speak of, based on the salary range his position carried. He had lost his income, his benefits, and his employment record over an act that had cost her nothing and saved, potentially, 2 lives. She had run a company for 6 years and made thousands of decisions, acquisitions, restructurings, terminations, reorganizations, and she had made them with analysis and without sentiment, because that was the standard she had set for herself and held to without exception. She had believed this was what professional rigor looked like. She had believed, because it was convenient to believe, that being decisive and being human were not in tension. She looked at her daughter's face for a long time. "Find out where he is," she told Sophia. "And get me Brandon Cole's file as well." In the weeks that followed Eleanor's discharge, Caleb moved through the days with the concentrated attention of a man dismantling a problem. He applied to 14 positions over the course of 3 weeks. 4 did not respond. 7 sent automated rejections within 48 hours, which meant his application hadn't survived the initial keyword filter. 2 had called him in for interviews, expressed interest, and then gone quiet. 1 had offered him a position at a salary 11% below his previous rate, with no benefits for the first 90 days of a probationary period. He had not accepted it yet. He was very close to accepting it. The savings account balance required no calculator. He'd cut the streaming subscription and the twice-weekly coffee from the place 2 blocks from Grace's school, and he was buying groceries differently now, smaller quantities, closer attention to unit prices, the calculator on his phone open in the produce aisle, with a frequency that had become automatic. He didn't tell his mother the details when she called. She had already given him $200 he hadn't asked for, and he wasn't going to let her reach for more. Grace had caught a cold in the 2nd week of November. Nothing serious, but the kind that settled into the chest and produced a cough that he heard through the wall between their rooms at night. He lay awake doing the math on a pediatrician visit without insurance coverage, and the math didn't produce comfortable results. He bought children's cold medicine at the pharmacy and monitored her temperature and told himself that if it wasn't better by Thursday, he'd find a way to manage the cost. It was better by Wednesday. He sat in the kitchen after she was asleep and felt a specific, private relief that nobody witnessed. He was at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening when his phone showed a missed call from an unknown city number. He listened to the voicemail. A woman's voice, professional, measured, unhurried, identified herself as Sophia Blake and said she was calling on behalf of Eleanor Vance and would appreciate the opportunity to speak with him at his earliest convenience. The message was exactly 30 seconds long. There was no additional information. He was at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening when his phone showed a missed call from an unknown city number. He listened to the voicemail. A woman's voice, professional, measured, unhurried, identified herself as Sophia Blake and said she was calling on behalf of Eleanor Vance and would appreciate the opportunity to speak with him at his earliest convenience. The message was exactly 30 seconds long. There was no additional information. Caleb listened to it twice. He set the phone on the table and looked at it for a moment. In another version of the situation, there might have been dread, the word CEO capable of meaning legal exposure, liability, a complication layered on top of a complication. But he didn't feel dread. He sat with the message in the quiet of the kitchen and felt something closer to the settled readiness of a person who has already accepted whatever comes next. He had no leverage and no strategy. He had only what he'd done and the truth of why he'd done it. And those were things he could stand on without needing the ground to change. Grace coughed softly from the other room. He picked up the phone and called the number back. The message the next morning was logistically simple. A car would collect him at 10 o'clock. He should plan to arrive at the Vance Industries building at 10:30. Nothing further. He dressed carefully in the only dress shirt that still fit him well, the dark one he kept for interviews, and drove to meet the car. He had told himself on the way that he was prepared for most contingencies. He wasn't entirely sure what most contingencies meant in a situation this formless. The Vance Industries lobby was the same as it always was, the enormous windows, the buffed floor that he and his crew had kept that way for 3 years, the framed portrait in the corridor beside the elevator bank. He stopped in front of it on his way through and looked at it for a moment longer than he usually did. The woman in the gray blazer, the expression he'd always read as cold authority. He looked at it differently now, and something in the set of her jaw read less like control and more like loneliness. Carefully managed, Sophia Blake met him at the elevators. Precise, professional, polite in the specific way of someone whose function is to make difficult situations smooth. She offered no additional information on the ride-up, and Caleb didn't ask for any. They stopped on 40, not 41. The conference room was large, running the length of the building's east face, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides. The table could seat 20. There were already a dozen people in the room when the door opened. Building management, HR, several faces from the facilities division, and Brandon Cole at the far end, whose expression when he looked up was unreadable in the way of someone working very hard to make it so. Eleanor Vance was standing at the windows with her arms at her sides. She did not look the way Caleb had expected. She was less like the portrait and more like a person. The composure was there. But it wasn't a mask exactly. It was something more like the specific stillness of someone who has spent considerable time deciding what they are about to say and no longer requires preparation for it. She looked at him when he came in with a directness that contained no performance. "Mr. Turner," she said, "thank you for coming." He sat where Sophia indicated, toward the center of the table, facing the windows. The room was quiet. No papers on the table. No slides loaded on the screen. Eleanor walked to the head of the table and stood there for a moment before she began. When she spoke, she used the same tone she used in quarterly reviews and acquisition briefings: precise, level, without theatrics. She laid out the account of October 12th in its entirety, what the security footage showed, what the medical records confirmed, what her own fragmented recollection contained. She named Caleb. She named the 2 employees who had been in sight, and continued walking. She ran the security footage on the screen without commentary and let the room watch it in silence. A man crossing a rain-wet parking structure toward a woman on the ground, making his decision in the space between seeing and reaching. The silence at the end of the footage sat for a long moment. Eleanor turned to Brandon Cole. Her expression had not changed. "You terminated this man," she said, "for doing the only human thing available to him in that situation." Brandon opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. One word, without heat. She looked at Caleb then, and something in her expression shifted not dramatically, but with the quiet specificity of a change that carries weight. "I have a question for you," she said. "Before anything else, why did you do it?" The room was still. Caleb sat with his hands on the table, and he didn't look away from her. "Because you needed help," he said. A pause. That's the whole answer. The room reorganized itself around those words in the way that rooms do when something true and simple has been said in them. Eleanor nodded once. Slowly. With a gravity that was entirely genuine. "It is," she said. She turned back to Brandon Cole. "You're terminated, effective today. HR will manage the separation details." She said it with the same level precision she'd used throughout. Brandon looked at the surface of the table. He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. Eleanor sat down then, across from Caleb, not at the head of the table, just in one of the chairs, at the same height as everyone else. It seemed deliberate. "I owe you an apology that I cannot make adequate," she said. "What happened to you in this company's name is not something I can entirely undo. But I intend to come as close as the available means allow." She held his gaze. "I've reviewed your full employment record and spoken with the building engineers about your work. There is a facilities operations manager position that has been open since August. I want you to apply for it through the standard process, the same as any candidate. I'm telling you it exists. What you do with it is yours." Caleb looked at her for a steady moment. "I don't want the job, because I drove you to a hospital." "I know," she said. "I'm not offering it because of that. I'm telling you it exists because you have the qualifications, and we have been doing a poor job of internal advancement for people in your division. Those are different things." He considered the distinction with the methodical precision he brought to everything. It was an accurate distinction. "When does the application window?" "Friday," Sophia said from the corner. "I'll apply Thursday," Caleb said. Something moved across Eleanor Vance's face. Small, interior, not quite a smile, but close enough that the people in the room who were watching her recognized it as something they hadn't seen before. "Good," she said. The interview was the following Wednesday. Caleb answered every question technically, directly, and without referencing the parking structure once. He outlined the documentation system failures he'd identified over 3 years of working within the inadequacies of the current setup. He described 2 equipment failure scenarios he'd diagnosed and resolved before they escalated. He proposed a cross-training protocol for the overnight team that he'd been drafting in a notebook for the better part of a year. The offer arrived 3 days later. By phone, a salary a third above his previous rate, full benefits from the first day, a team of 6 direct reports, and a mandate to redesign the facility's operations documentation from the ground up. He called his mother that evening and told her the job situation had resolved and not to worry. She didn't say several things very pointedly on her end of the line. He took Grace to the park on Saturday, the first Saturday in a month that didn't have an application or an interview or a quiet, grinding worry attached to it. They walked through the fallen leaves, and she told him at considerable length about something that had happened at school involving a spider and a classmate's lunchbox, and he listened to every word and asked the exactly right questions, and the afternoon was long and ordinary and good. Eleanor Vance came to the apartment on a Sunday in late November. She had called ahead, through Sophia, and Caleb had told Grace that a visitor was coming, which Grace had received with focused attention and no further questions. The apartment was clean, it was always clean, and there were good smells from the kitchen because somewhere between accepting the call and the afternoon, Caleb had made the quiet decision that this was an occasion for actual cooking. Eleanor arrived with a small bag from a children's bookstore. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen looking. For the first time since Caleb had observed her in any capacity, slightly less certain of herself than the situation's practical demands required. She looked around the apartment not judgmentally, just taking it in, and something in her expression was careful and attentive in a way that wasn't clinical. Grace appeared from the hallway, assessed Eleanor from across the room, and then walked directly to her and looked up. "You're the lady my dad helped," Grace said. Eleanor crouched down to her level, which brought them to the same height. "I am. Are you okay now?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I have a baby girl. She's at home right now, but she's doing very well." Grace considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Then she reached out and took Eleanor's hand, not tentatively, not as a gesture, but in the simple, declarative way that children have of deciding things, as if placing her hand there settled the matter of something that had previously been unsettled. "Good," Grace said. Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway and said nothing. There was something in that moment, his daughter's hand in the hand of the woman he'd carried through the rain, the low afternoon light through the window, the smell of something warm on the stove, that he knew he would carry for a very long time. The policy changes at Vance Industries came in January, announced at the first all-staff meeting of the new year. Eleanor delivered them herself, standing at the front of the main conference room in a charcoal blazer, without notes and without preamble. There would be a new emergency assistance protocol, superseding any attendance or productivity policy in situations involving immediate physical need. There would be a mandatory quarterly review of internal promotion candidates from the maintenance and operations divisions. There would be a full audit of every procedural framework that had allowed a man to lose his livelihood for performing an act of basic human care. The policy document ran to 22 pages. Sophia had suggested calling it the Turner Protocol. Eleanor had resisted the name for 3 days and then conceded it was accurate. Caleb sat in the third row at the meeting and did not draw attention to himself. He had not asked for any of it. He had asked for nothing beyond the chance to do a job well and come home to his daughter, which had been true before any of this, and remained true now. The difference was that the work was no longer invisible in the way it had been, not because he needed the visibility, but because the company had finally learned the cost of not seeing it. The invisible hours remained, the maintenance bays, and the overnight shifts, and the men and women who moved through the building in the quiet hours before the day staff arrived. That work continued, as it always had, as it always would. But something in the culture of it had shifted. The people doing it were no longer expected to be grateful for being overlooked. His shoes didn't let in water anymore. Grace's coat fit at the wrist and the elbow, with a little room to grow into. The gas bill was paid, and the one after it. And somewhere on the 41st floor, a woman who had once constructed her competence as a wall against the admission of needing anything, was learning, slowly, and with the specific sincerity of someone who does not do things halfway, the mathematics of what you can carry when you stop carrying it alone. She was not, by nature, a person who arrived at warmth easily, but she was, by nature, a person who once she recognized a direction worth moving in did not stop. The city went on around all of them, loud, indifferent, full of people in their own stories at their own crossroads. Each one making or not making the calculation, giving or withholding, paying or protecting, in the 10,000 ordinary moments that don't look like decisions until you look at them from the other side. One man had stood in a rainy parking structure and made a choice that cost him something real. He had not made it for reward or recognition, or because he thought it would lead somewhere. He had made it because a person needed help, and he was standing close enough to give it, and that was all the reasoning the situation required. That had been the whole answer. That was still the whole answer. Some truths are simple enough that they don't require revision. You just have to be willing to act on them when they arrive in the rain, in the dark, with everything on the line before the moment passes, and all that remains is the question of what you would have done.